There are few names that still echo through time like his. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who crowned himself emperor, who turned revolutions into empires, who believed he could command destiny itself. But destiny always collects its debt. He once ruled Europe, shattered kings, redrew borders, left millions in his shadow. To some, a savior. To others, a monster. And then, he vanished, exiled to a rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, a place so bleak, so forgotten, it might as well have been another world. St. Helena. Here, the emperor of Europe began to rot, alone, broken, and dying in unbearable agony. But his death was no ordinary death. It was slow. It was cruel. And some say it wasn't natural. Because when Napoleon's heart stopped beating, the whispers began. Whispers that he'd been murdered. Was it the British? A traitor among his servants? Or something darker? Something that haunted that cursed island itself? All we know is this. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the master of empires, met his end as a prisoner of his own body, on a haunted rock where even the sea still howls his name. The year was 1815. Europe, battered, bloodied, and exhausted, had finally seen enough of Napoleon Bonaparte. After more than a decade of war, the continent had become a graveyard of empires and kings. Napoleon's dreams of domination had burned too bright, too fast, until the fires consumed him. And at Waterloo, those fires were finally extinguished. He surrendered to the British aboard the ship Bellerophon, perhaps still believing that the men who once admired his genius would treat him with honor. After all, he was Napoleon, the great strategist, the lawmaker, the emperor who had reshaped Europe itself. Surely they would allow him a peaceful exile, perhaps a quiet life in the English countryside or some neutral territory where he could live as a gentleman in retirement. But the British had other plans. They remembered Elba. The first time Napoleon was exiled, just a year earlier, he had escaped. In February 1815, he slipped past his guards, returned to France, and reclaimed power without firing a single shot. The world watched in disbelief as the man they thought defeated rose again, like a phantom marching back from the grave. For 100 days he ruled once more, 100 days that shook the world. And then, Waterloo, his final defeat. So this time, the British decided there would be no second escape. They needed a prison that no man could flee. A place so remote, so forgotten, that even the thought of rescue would die in the attempt. They chose St. Helena, an island smaller than the city of Paris, a jagged lump of volcanic rock lost in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. It was over 200 miles from Africa, 2,000 miles from Brazil, surrounded by nothing but endless, hostile sea. Ships took weeks to reach it, if they made it at all. The winds were treacherous, the waves unending. It was not a place for life. It was a place for exile. And that is where they sent the Emperor of France. Napoleon arrived at St. Helena in October 1815, aboard the HMS Northumberland. Witnesses said he stood on deck as the island appeared on the horizon, a black, jagged mass rising from gray water cloaked in mist. He didn't speak. He just stared. Some said the look in his eyes was one of disbelief. Others said it was fury. He called it the worst place on earth. And when he stepped ashore, he was no longer a ruler, but a captive. His new residence was Longwood House, perched high on a windy plateau, miles from the harbor. Once meant for a British officer, it was hastily repurposed for the most infamous prisoner in the world. But Longwood was no palace. The walls oozed damp. The ceilings dripped. The floors were warped and swollen from years of humidity. The entire structure seemed to rot from within. Rats scurried through the corridors. Mold crept up the walls. Even the furniture, imported from England, began to decay in the island's suffocating air. Napoleon, accustomed to marble halls and glittering chandeliers, now lived surrounded by mildew, insects, and the perpetual scent of decay. He called it my tomb. Each morning, the wind would batter the windows. Each night, rain would seep through the roof. The constant dampness infected everything, his clothes, his books, his lungs. Within months, the emperor began to fall ill. He complained of chronic pain in his stomach. His appetite faded. His complexion turned ashen. He was often seen doubled over, clutching his abdomen. To the British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, it was a nuisance. To Napoleon's attendants, it was the beginning of something terrible. But illness wasn't his only torment. There was another, more calculated cruelty: humiliation. Governor Hudson Lowe, the man in charge of his imprisonment, was obsessed with control. He despised Napoleon. And he despised the idea that even as a captive, the emperor still commanded respect from his followers. So Lowe made it his mission to strip Napoleon of every trace of his former glory. He refused to address him as emperor, calling him merely General Bonaparte. He restricted his visitors, monitored his letters, and denied him access to newspapers or news from Europe. Every request, no matter how small, was delayed, debated, or denied. Napoleon once asked for a few trees to be planted near his home to shield it from the merciless wind. Lowe refused, saying it would aid in escape. He asked for better wine, better clothing, books, anything to preserve his dignity. Again, Lowe refused. It was as if the British governor wanted to make him vanish, not just from the world, but from history itself. Napoleon began to write letters, to his family, to his former comrades, to anyone who would listen, but most never reached their destination, intercepted, censored, destroyed. The Emperor of France was now just a man, cut off from the world, surrounded by guards with nothing left but memory. Isolation does strange things to a man. At first, Napoleon resisted. He tried to live with discipline, keeping a strict routine, dictating his memoirs, and walking through the gardens each morning. But St. Helena was relentless. The endless winds howled through the night like a curse. The rains came without warning. The damp never lifted. Weeks blurred into months. Seasons passed without notice. And the emperor who had once commanded nations began to fade into a ghost. His attendants described him pacing the same worn path outside Longwood, staring out toward the sea. He would watch the horizon for hours, as if expecting a ship that would never come. Sometimes he spoke aloud, to no one. Sometimes he laughed softly, bitterly, at his own memories. To those around him, it seemed as though the island itself was swallowing him whole. Napoleon had faced cannons, betrayals, and revolutions, but he was utterly defenseless against time. And yet, St. Helena was not finished with him, because the longer he stayed, the more his body began to betray him in ways no one could explain. At first, he blamed the climate, then the food, then the English doctors. But what if it wasn't the island at all? What if it was something far more deliberate, already coursing through his veins? As Napoleon lay awake in the damp darkness of Longwood House, he could not have known that his final war had already begun, a silent battle inside his own body. And this time, he would not win. By the year 1818, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer a prisoner of the British. He was a prisoner of his own body. The transformation had begun subtly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was fatigue. He'd grow tired after short walks, leaning on his valet's arm for support. Then came the stomach pain, sharp, relentless, twisting deep inside him like a blade he couldn't remove. No one knew it then, but the same iron stomach that had endured the frozen mud of Russia and the meager rations of siege camps was rotting from within. Something malignant had taken root. And yet, to the British authorities, it was just another inconvenience. Governor Hudson Lowe, that meticulous bureaucrat who saw Napoleon not as a man but as a threat, believed the emperor was exaggerating his illness, feigning weakness, plotting sympathy from Europe. So when Napoleon complained of constant pain, Lowe called him a liar. When his appetite disappeared, Lowe accused him of manipulation. And when his skin turned pale and his strength began to fade, Lowe said it was the laziness of a fallen despot. But those who lived with him, those who saw what happened behind the sealed windows of Longwood House, knew the truth. Napoleon's days became ritualistic, mechanical, haunted by pain. Each morning, He forced himself to dress properly, still wearing his military coat even when he could barely button it. His once fitted uniform now hung loose, the fabric sagging over bones that jutted out like daggers beneath his skin. He would sit by the small wooden table in his drawing room, surrounded by maps of old campaigns, Austerlitz, Jena, Borodino, as though by staring at them he could will himself back into those days of triumph. But those victories were ghosts now, whispering from the past, and ghosts were all he had left. In the evenings, when the sea winds tore at the windows and the rain hissed against the roof, Napoleon would read. He devoured books on philosophy, history, even religion, subjects he had once dismissed. Sometimes he read aloud to his attendants, his voice still commanding, still sharp, until a wave of nausea forced him to stop mid-sentence. His attendants noted the change. He slept more, he ate less, and the baths became an obsession. Every afternoon he demanded to be lowered into the great copper tub in his quarters. He would lie there for hours, the water so hot it reddened his skin, adding more heat whenever it cooled. He said it was the only thing that calmed the fire in his stomach. To those watching, it looked less like comfort and more like penance. The Emperor of France, once feared across Europe, reduced to a pale figure half submerged in scalding water, his flesh steaming, his eyes vacant. Sometimes he would fall asleep in that bath. Other times he would mutter to himself, half memories, half delirium. "Josephine," he whispered once, "send the cavalry forward." By 1819, his illness had become impossible to ignore. His stomach distended grotesquely. He vomited frequently, the liquid dark and foul-smelling. Even water turned his stomach. Food, once a matter of discipline, never pleasure, became an enemy. He could no longer ride his horse. Even standing was an effort. His legs trembled. His face, once broad and strong, had hollowed out. Only the eyes remained, the cold gray eyes that had frozen generals on the battlefield. But now, even they seemed dimmer, as if the fire inside was slowly dying out. Meanwhile, Hudson Lowe tightened the noose. He accused Napoleon's attendants of smuggling messages. He intercepted letters, censored correspondence, and even searched their rooms for secret documents. He ordered that all visitors, every servant, every aide, be counted and logged. He limited the emperor's walks to within a few hundred yards of Longwood House. To humiliate him further, Lowe instructed soldiers to follow him on these walks, their muskets gleaming in the sun, a constant reminder that even here, even now, Napoleon was still watched. The emperor tried to ignore them. He would walk slowly through the gardens, breathing the heavy air, his steps deliberate. But the soldiers' eyes followed his every move. He could feel their gaze on his back like a physical weight. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest torment of all. For Napoleon, who once commanded millions, who had marched at the head of armies across Europe, now had to ask permission to take a walk in his own garden. The pain worsened. His attendants recorded that he often woke in the middle of the night, screaming, clutching his abdomen. His sheets would be soaked in sweat. Sometimes the screams turned into curses, against the British, against Lowe, against his own fate. And then, as quickly as the rage came, it would vanish. He would grow quiet, detached. He would stare at the ceiling for hours, as if he were already halfway gone. One morning, his valet marchand found him collapsed beside his bed. He had tried to rise too quickly and fainted. When they helped him up, he waved them off, insisting he was fine. "An emperor does not fall," he said weakly, but his voice trembled. The truth was undeniable. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the master of Europe, was dying, piece by piece, day by day. By late 1819, the rumors had begun to spread beyond St. Helena. Sailors and passing merchants carried whispers to the ports of England. Napoleon is sick. Napoleon is dying. Some said he was wasting away from grief. Others believed the British were poisoning him. And perhaps, in a way, they were. Not with deliberate intent, but with neglect, contempt, and the barbaric medicine of the time. Napoleon's doctors prescribed calomel, a compound made of mercury chloride. They claimed it would purify the body. In reality, it corroded his insides, accelerating the decay. Every dose left him weaker, his gums bleeding, his stomach more inflamed. Yet the doctors insisted it was working, that the emperor was purging his sickness. He was, just not in the way they imagined. The pain became constant. The baths, the mercury, the bleeding, they did nothing. Napoleon could feel it now, a pressure deep inside, as if something was growing, feeding, pressing against his ribs. He began to believe it was punishment, divine justice for the wars he had unleashed, the millions who had died under his command. He told Marchand one night, "Perhaps God keeps me alive to make me suffer the death I gave to others." Those words chilled everyone in the room. It was the first time the emperor had spoken of guilt, and so, day after day, the same ritual repeated: baths, pain, vomiting, the endless waiting for a death that refused to come. Outside Longwood, the Atlantic winds howled like mourning spirits. Inside, the Emperor of France lay rotting in slow motion. He had fought wars that changed the face of Europe. But this battle was one he could not win. The British thought they had imprisoned Napoleon on an island. But in truth, his real prison was his own body, betraying him from within, one agonizing breath at a time. And what came next would turn that slow decay into something far more horrifying. Because the disease inside him was done hiding, it was ready to consume the emperor whole. By 1821, the great emperor of Europe had become a ghost of himself. The man who once commanded entire nations now lay in a small, damp room, surrounded by mold, decay, and whispers of death. The island of St. Helena was not a tropical paradise. It was a prison made of stone and mist. The wind screamed through the valleys like lost souls, and the air carried a stench of salt, rot, and something far worse: hopelessness. Napoleon was forbidden from wandering freely. His guards watched every move, their boots echoing outside his chamber like a grim heartbeat. The once mighty conqueror's health deteriorated at an alarming pace. At first it was exhaustion, then a gnawing pain in his stomach that never left. He described it as a fire inside him, burning and eating away at his strength. His appetite vanished. His body swelled. His skin turned a pale yellow, almost wax-like. Sometimes he vomited a dark, thick liquid that smelled of blood and iron, and yet the British doctors brushed it off as chronic liver disease. But to those who watched him closely, something else was happening. Something darker. Years after his death, whispers began to spread. Had Napoleon been poisoned? The evidence was disturbingly convincing. A few strands of his hair, preserved as relics by loyal followers, later revealed dangerously high levels of arsenic, enough to slowly kill a man. Arsenic, the inheritance powder, was the poison of choice in the 19th century. Tasteless, slow-acting, and near impossible to detect at the time. It mimicked the symptoms of stomach cancer: pain, weakness, vomiting, and eventual collapse. Some claimed the wallpaper in his room contained arsenic dye, and the damp air released its deadly vapors. Others pointed fingers at his British captors, men who had every reason to make sure Napoleon never left the island alive. And then, there were those who suspected one of his own, a loyal servant who had grown too close, too desperate, too fanatical. But no one could ever prove it, because the island kept its secrets, and the dead kept theirs. In his final months, Napoleon began to drift between lucidity and hallucination. He often spoke to invisible figures: his mother, his old generals, even Josephine. At times, he would sit up suddenly, his fevered eyes scanning the empty room, whispering, "They are calling me. My army is calling." His attendants wrote that he wept in his sleep, calling out for his son, the King of Rome, a boy he would never see again. He also began to record his dreams, describing vivid visions of vast battlefields covered in snow and smoke, and a shadowy figure standing over him with a crown of thorns. Even the sound of the ocean, endless and relentless, began to torment him. He said it reminded him of a million voices whispering about my defeat. For a man who once ruled empires, isolation was the cruelest torture. Napoleon's chamber at Longwood House was a place of quiet horror. The walls were wet with condensation, and black mold crept up from the corners like veins. The roof leaked constantly. Sometimes rainwater would drip directly onto his bed as he lay dying. Rats scuttled under the floorboards. The furniture, simple, crude, unworthy of an emperor, was falling apart. Even his books, his one solace, were mildewed and swollen from the damp. He requested the windows remain open so he could breathe, but the cold wind made him shiver violently. He was caught between suffocation and frost. No comfort, only choices of pain. The island's isolation had become a living being, feeding on him. The guards saw less and less of him. Each time they caught a glimpse, he was thinner, his uniform hanging loose on his frail frame, his eyes dull and sunken. One visitor later wrote, "He was no longer the eagle of Austerlitz, but a broken man, fluttering his wings in a cage of stone." In early May 1821, Napoleon's breathing grew shallow. The pain had spread across his body. He refused to take much food, whispering, "It is useless now." Those who stood by him, Count Montholon, his faithful servant Marchand, and a handful of others, described the room as heavy, almost choking with the smell of sickness and damp wood. Outside, the wind howled like a funeral dirge. On the night of May 5th, the sky turned dark red, a strange phenomenon that frightened even the guards. Some said it was the sky mourning the emperor. Others said it was an omen. At 5:49 p.m., Napoleon muttered his final words. France, army, head of the army, Josephine, and then silence. Only the sound of the storm remained. When they placed a candle by his face, his skin had already taken on a gray-green hue. His lips were blackened, and his eyes, half open, seemed to still glare at something unseen. The doctor who performed the autopsy later wrote that Napoleon's stomach was eaten away. Inside they found a massive ulcer and a black residue that smelled faintly of almonds, the signature scent of arsenic. But the British suppressed the report. The world was told the emperor had died of natural causes. A few days later, his body was washed, dressed in his favorite uniform, the green coat of the chasseurs of the guard, and laid upon his bed. The soldiers who came to see him swore he looked peaceful, almost regal again. Even in death, he commanded attention. A death mask was made from his face, but something eerie happened. The mask seemed slightly off. The eyes were hollow, the lips twisted in a faint smirk. Some said it was because the plaster had been taken too late. Others claimed the mask captured his final emotion, defiance. A man who even in death refused to bow to anyone. His body was buried on St. Helena under a plain slab of stone marked only with the word Napoleon. The British refused to let the word emperor be inscribed, but the story did not end there, because years later, when his body was exhumed and returned to France, it was found perfectly preserved, no decay, no rot, his face still recognizable as if he had merely fallen asleep. Scientists called it a miracle, historians called it strange, and others whispered that perhaps the island had not finished with him after all. When the great conqueror's heart stopped beating, the world didn't simply move on. It shuddered. Even on that tiny windswept island in the South Atlantic, something changed in the air, as if the island itself exhaled after years of holding its breath. The British guards, who once cursed his name, began to speak in hushed tones. The locals, who had long resented his presence, left offerings at his grave. And far away in France, millions mourned as if their god had been slain. But death was only the beginning of Napoleon's final mystery, because what followed was something that defied both science and reason, a puzzle of flesh, poison, and legend that still haunts historians to this day. For nearly 2 decades after his burial in 1821, Napoleon's tomb lay untouched. No grand mausoleum, no royal ceremony. Just a modest grave surrounded by willows, far from the empire he once ruled. But in 1840, under the reign of King Louis-Philippe, France demanded the emperor back. They called it le retour des cendres, the return of the ashes. The British, reluctant but ultimately yielding, allowed Napoleon's remains to be exhumed and returned to his homeland. When the tomb was opened, the men expected to find a skeleton, a mere shadow of the emperor. Instead, what they saw left them speechless. Napoleon's body was intact, perfectly preserved, his uniform still brilliant green, his boots unmarred by time, his face, unmistakably his, serene, almost alive. One of the witnesses, Captain Alexander, wrote, "He seemed not dead but sleeping. The features were calm and noble, the flesh had not decayed." How could this be? 20 years in a damp, tropical grave, and yet not a trace of rot. Some believed it was divine, that France's emperor had been blessed, untouched by corruption. Others whispered darker things, that whatever had killed him had also preserved him. Modern scientists have proposed a theory: arsenic. Arsenic, while lethal, is also a natural preservative. It halts bacterial decay, stiffens tissue, and can even give the skin a lifelike pallor. If Napoleon had indeed been poisoned slowly, intentionally or otherwise, his body would have absorbed enough arsenic to preserve it long after death. It's the cruelest irony imaginable. The very substance that killed him may have immortalized him. But there's more. When later tests were done on the strands of his hair, collected from different periods of his exile, they revealed consistent traces of arsenic, not just near the end. This suggested a prolonged exposure, not a single poisoning. So, was Napoleon being poisoned slowly over the years, by the damp walls laced with toxic pigments, by contaminated wine or food? Or was it something more deliberate, a slow, invisible execution sanctioned by his captors? The British, of course, denied everything, but even their own officers noted the strange conditions of Longwood House: the foul air, the greenish wallpaper, the metallic taste of water. Whether by malice or accident, the emperor's exile had become a slow-motion death sentence. And when he finally succumbed, nature could not claim him. But then came the rumor that changed everything. When the body was brought to France, some of those who had known Napoleon personally began to whisper that the corpse wasn't his. The facial features, they said, seemed subtly wrong. The nose shorter, the chin too soft. Had the British replaced the real body before handing it over? Had they buried a decoy while keeping Napoleon's remains for study or for secrecy? It sounds absurd. Yet the claim refused to die. Some even proposed that Napoleon had escaped St. Helena alive, that a double had been buried in his place, and that the emperor had lived in disguise somewhere in Europe. No proof was ever found. But the persistence of the story says something about the man himself. Even death could not strip Napoleon of myth. In the years following his return, those connected to his captivity began to die strangely. Sir Hudson Lowe, the governor who oversaw his imprisonment, was said to have been tormented by nightmares, dreams of a figure in green military dress standing at his bedside, whispering in French, "You have buried me alive." Lowe died in misery, isolated, despised by both the British and the French. Several of the doctors who treated Napoleon also met grim ends. One fell ill and wasted away within months. Another vanished during a sea voyage, his ship never found. Coincidence, perhaps. Or the lingering reach of the emperor's spirit. Visitors to St. Helena even today claim to feel a strange heaviness around his old residence. Some hear footsteps pacing in the night. Others swear they've smelled gunpowder in the damp halls of Longwood House, as if an invisible army still marched there. What's most haunting, perhaps, is that even in death, Napoleon remained a prisoner. His tomb in Paris, the grand sarcophagus beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, is vast, almost suffocating. The emperor lies encased within 6 coffins, one inside another: tin, mahogany, lead, ebony, and finally red porphyry. It's as though the French wanted to keep him safe forever, or as though they feared what might happen if he ever rose again. His body rests far below the surface, viewed from above by those who walk the marble floor. They must look down upon him, an irony not lost on history's greatest ego. He who once looked down on kings now lies beneath the gaze of tourists and time. But even buried, Napoleon's presence refused to fade. His legend grew stronger with every passing decade. Painters immortalized him as a tragic hero. Writers described him as a fallen god. To his followers, he was not defeated, merely waiting. His tomb became a place of pilgrimage. Some left flowers, others left messages, and a few, it is said, came to whisper secrets to the marble walls, as if seeking his counsel from beyond. Historians still debate the truth. Was he poisoned? Was his corpse swapped? Was his preservation divine or chemical? But one thing is certain: Napoleon Bonaparte, even in death, refused to vanish. He became what every conqueror dreams of becoming: a story that can never die. Perhaps that's the true horror, not that Napoleon was murdered or that his body was preserved by poison, but that he achieved something darker. Immortality through decay. He became a relic of obsession, a man who conquered nations and then conquered death itself by being too important to rot. His grave, his mask, his very hair, all turned into relics, traded and worshipped by those who wanted to hold a piece of his power. But power, even in fragments, carries a curse. For every man who sought to possess a piece of Napoleon, history whispers the same warning. He never belonged to the living. Napoleon once said, "Death is nothing, but to live defeated and inglorious is to die daily." He never truly died, because even now, in books, in museums, in the whispers of scholars, his ghost lingers. A reminder that greatness and madness are separated only by a thin, blood-stained line. The emperor's war ended long ago, but his shadow still marches. There is a silence that comes after great storms, a silence so heavy that it feels alive. That was the silence that followed Napoleon Bonaparte, when the guns of Europe fell quiet, when the smoke of battle drifted away. The world looked upon the ruins he left behind and realized something terrifying. Napoleon had not just changed history, he had possessed it. He was gone, yes. But the idea of him, the force of his will, remained, and for some, it still does. In Paris, beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, lies the emperor's final resting place. It is silent there, too silent. Visitors walk the polished marble halls, their footsteps echoing like whispers in a cathedral built for one man's vanity. And when they peer down into the circular crypt below, they see it, a colossal red sarcophagus, smooth and cold as bloodstone. Inside that sarcophagus, Napoleon rests, not once, not twice, but 6 times over. Each coffin encased within another, as though layer by layer, the French tried to cage a spirit that refused to stay buried. Tin, mahogany, lead, ebony, iron, porphyry. A prison made not of walls but of legacy. Some say it was meant to preserve him, others whisper it was meant to contain him. Because even in death, the emperor's presence had power, too much power. Guards reported strange things in those early years. The sound of faint footsteps echoing through the crypt at night, a soft tapping against the inner coffin, the flicker of candles when no wind blew. One custodian swore he heard a voice murmur in French, "Still they look down upon me." He quit his post the next day. What's strange is how Napoleon's influence refused to fade. Years after his death, revolutions began across Europe, each claiming to follow his vision, his order, his empire. Dictators rose wearing his mask of destiny. Men who dreamed of conquest whispered his name before their wars. The emperor had become a phantom general, marching at the head of every tyrant's ambition. He had lost his body, but not his influence. He had traded his crown for a curse. In every century since, when power swells and nations tremble, historians return to him, to study, to dissect, to fear. Because in Napoleon they see a reflection of humanity's oldest hunger, the need to dominate and to be remembered. Far from Paris, on that lonely rock in the South Atlantic, the winds still howl around Longwood House. The rooms are empty now, stripped of furniture, haunted by the weight of memory. Tourists visit, taking photographs of peeling wallpaper and the bed where the emperor died. But some say the place doesn't like visitors. A few have reported strange things. A sudden chill that sweeps through the room, even on warm days, the faint smell of gunpowder or wet leather. And once, a historian claimed he heard the soft creak of boots pacing the floor, back and forth, as if someone were still planning a campaign that never ended. Perhaps the island never released him. Perhaps the sea, the wind, and the earth still remember the man who defied them all. Because how do you bury ambition? How do you silence a man whose every breath once changed the fate of continents? You don't. You simply wait for his echo to fade, and it never quite does. The strangest part of all remains his preservation. 2 decades in a tropical grave, and not a hint of decay. Scientists have argued, tested, and debated, but no one can fully explain it. If it was arsenic, then fate itself played a cruel joke. The poison meant to destroy him also made him eternal. If it wasn't, then perhaps something far more unsettling kept him intact. There's a legend that circulates among the staff at Les Invalides. They say that when the tomb was being cleaned decades ago, one of the workers leaned too close and claimed to hear a faint rhythmic sound. Not wind, not footsteps, but breathing. They laughed at him, of course, but the worker never returned to that chamber again. Napoleon once said, "Glory is fleeting, but obscurity is forever." He feared being forgotten more than he feared death itself. And in that, perhaps, lies the true horror of his story. Because he got exactly what he wanted, the world never forgot him, but it also never let him rest. He became trapped in the story he created. A prisoner not of the British, not of the island, but of immortality itself. The emperor who could command millions couldn't command peace. The conqueror who ruled empires couldn't conquer death. His victories, his pride, his ambition, they became the chains that kept his ghost awake. Every king who rose after him feared him. Every soldier admired him. Every historian questioned him. And in that endless fascination, Napoleon Bonaparte became something more than a man. He became a mirror, showing us what happens when power outlives purpose. If you stand in the tomb long enough, the silence starts to hum. You can almost hear the rustle of maps, the scratch of a quill, the echo of boots on marble. You can almost imagine him there, the short man with the burning eyes, planning his next campaign against eternity. And in that moment, you understand. He didn't die on St. Helena. He didn't die in 1821. He lives on, in history's bloodstream, in ambition's shadow, in every story of power that ends in ruin. Napoleon's body was buried, his empire crumbled, but his hunger, that relentless, consuming hunger, still walks beside us. It lives in every man who looks at the world and thinks, "I can rule it." So the next time you hear the wind whisper through the corridors of Les Invalides, or the waves crash against the black cliffs of St. Helena, listen closely. Because somewhere, beneath stone and sea, a restless voice still murmurs in the dark. France, army, head of the army, Josephine. And in that whisper, history trembles, because the emperor never truly fell. He simply waits, and the world, still haunted by his shadow, waits with him. Empires die, legends do not.